Hi, everybody. It's Jamie. We are starting our 4th season of the show on January 6th. But in the meantime, we wanted to share a special bonus episode with you. This is a bonus episode with my husband and co-creator of the show, Piet Hurkmans. So most of the time, If You Knew Me shares stories from the inner lives of women, stories about the things that women feel, think, believe, and want, but almost never take the time to tell themselves, let alone their close friends or lovers. But this week, we are going to be talking to Piet. He is a man, and he is working with me side by side to create this show, and we thought that you guys would really enjoy getting to know him a little bit better and understanding directly from him why he is passionate about creating this show. But before we dive in with Piet, I just want to thank all of our supporters on Patreon. Really, thank you so much for supporting this show. If you don't know, it costs $3 or more a month, and you can submit ideas for guests, as well as get behind-the-scenes extras. That's at patreon.com/ifyouknewme. We'll also put a link in the show notes. And just also want to say, if you haven't subscribed yet to the show, you might want to do that now before this next season starts so that you definitely get them when it drops on January 6th. Now, on to the show. Most weeks on If You Knew Me, we walk into the heart and mind of one woman. Our guests usually share their names, but sometimes they remain anonymous. And on other weeks, we offer interviews with experts that talk about themes that are relevant to women's lives. This week, we are talking to Piet Hurkmans. Again, Piet is my husband, and he is the co-creator of the show. Just so you know, Piet's first name is spelled P-I-E-T. To most English-speaking people, they kind of have trouble with that, and they think it's like Piet. But anyway, thank you so much for listening in, and this is where we're going to dive in with Piet. So, Piet, before we get going with talking directly about your relationship to this show and why you help make a show about the inner lives of women, I was wondering if you could just tell folks about where you grew up and what kind of family you grew up in.
Okay, yeah. I was born in the south of the Netherlands, in the province of Brabant, North Brabant it's called. In a working class family, I had 2 sisters. Actually, I had a third sister, but there wasn't talked about her. She died very early when I was 4 years old, so I don't have a clear memory of that, but nobody talked about her. Later, I found that very strange, and I dived more into the history of that, but I just didn't understand it. And when people asked me, hey, Piet, what kind of family you're from? For a big part of my life, I said, well, I'm from a family of 3 children. I had 2 sisters, and I really had to understand better what happened in my family, why I said that, why I said I had 2 sisters, because nobody talked about her. So actually, my sister Heleen, that was her name, she was born when I was 4 years old, and 4 days later, after her birth, she died because she had too big of a heart and she couldn't survive. And somehow my parents found it very hard to deal with that loss and never talked about her. It was just silence around her existence. She didn't exist.
And how do you think that affected you, if I may ask?
I think it deeply affected me over the course of my life without knowing it, of course, consciously. It was more I guess when I entered high school and had new friends and went to their families, I discovered hey, these friends have completely different families than I have. For me, the life in my family, that was kind of normal, that I experienced. This is normal. My family is kind of a normal family. The way they behaved and the way they, weren't really talking about their emotions and especially not talking about the sister that had died. And then I later discovered it's kind of a strange family I grew up in. Why was that happening? I really didn't understand it. So I guess over the course of my entire life, I tried to give this a place in my life. Why was I talking about 2 sisters for a long time? And then later I tried to honor her for the fact that she wasn't talked about. I saw this as a mission later in my life to deal with my own mourning and my own loss of a sister I never knew.
Did you really feel it that way, mourning her death? Can you describe that?
I don't think it was mourning her death. It was more the way I had developed myself emotionally, that I was very sensitive. Let's say I had a deep need for being understood, and somehow I didn't get that from my parents because of their personalities, I guess, but also because they weren't really capable of doing that. And I never understood why that was happening. And I later kind of learned that they had a deep trouble in dealing with their mourning, and this affected me in the sense that, for example, I couldn't be ill. I couldn't be sick. If I was telling, "Hey, Mom, I'm sick," then she kind of basically ignored that. Because that's what I later learned. I think she was just afraid that her other children also were going to die, to put it like that. That if they were having some ailment or an illness, that she thought, oh, this is the beginning of a new loss.
So when you look later, and maybe you can talk about what you ended up going on to study and do later in life. I mean, now obviously you helped produce this show, but you also have trained people in what's called authentic speaking. So do you see a relationship between Heleen's death and what you've ultimately chosen to do later in life?
Yeah, when I started doing this public speaking training, I realized that people find it very hard to be themselves in front of an audience, and find it very hard to communicate what they really wanted to say. And I myself also realized that that's a thing I've been taught. Don't say what's up your mind or how you're feeling, because somehow nobody's listening to that. And I believe that I had to do some restorative work there, that would be my mission, to create a clearer, more authentic way of communicating, saying what's happening with you, being curious of what other people are telling you, and being curious of their emotional lives, and really being understood. And that's a big part of public speaking role, that you basically always talk to an audience, and the audience is a group of people that wants to be seen and heard, and that's where you have a great role as a speaker. And I saw that as a magnification of the thing that didn't happen in my life. I wasn't seen or heard by my own parents. And in the worst case, they didn't even talk about somebody who really existed, my sister.
I wonder if we could just jump to the present moment in this show that we're creating, and just give listeners a little bit of a deeper understanding of why you want to produce a show about the inner lives of women as opposed to the inner lives of men, how you think about that, and why you think that this show is important.
Yeah, looking in general at the world, what's happening right now, there's a huge call for change. Everybody wants to change. There's so many things happening that makes people angry, like in racism and gender equality and in wars that's going on, the Me Too movement, all these examples of, let's say, the effect of people in power, and that often in the past that have been men. Men were having the power, and somehow I believe if change needs to happen in the world, I intuitively expect that change will come from women, that they're more willing to look into themselves, and that they're willing to change their position, that they can influence other people by changing themselves. And I don't see men really doing that right away.
Why not?
Because I think they have a lot to lose. They're kind of facing a position that they have to give up, because they were owning that traditionally, and now they're being basically questioned and attacked because of their behavior over the course of centuries, actually. And I don't think they're equipped for doing that, actually. They're equipped for protecting and for attacking and for making war and that kind of stuff, but they're not equipped for changing what the world needs right now. They can do that on a technological level, I believe, but not on a spiritual level. I don't really expect them to do that.
As a whole?
As a whole, yeah. And I see that women are kind of more open. Maybe it's a funny example, but in this training, authentic speaking, I've been giving for 12 years right now, in the beginning, men didn't even come. It was only women that came to that.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. Women were kind of willing to look at themselves and to change their behavior and their way of dealing with stuff in general and in relationships. And they were really wanting to learn. And men, well, they hardly came in the beginning. Like the courses were usually signed up for by 60, 70% of women and 30% of men, maybe. Where I kind of like thought, hey, this is interesting. I think women are really willing to change, and we have to give them a stage and an encouragement to do that and believe in what they want to change instead of like pushing them back all the time, because I think that's what traditionally happened, that they were discriminated and they were belittled and
abused, raped,
patronized, all the things you can mention. I don't think men have that experience. They went to war, that's what they did. And then later in the modern war, they basically experienced that in their careers. They're competing all the time against other men. They're not being forced to that kind of change.
I'm curious, you are the editor for our show. And so I will sit and I will do interviews, or I call them recording sessions with women, because sometimes I only ask one question, sometimes I ask more. And then you have this 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes of tape of this woman who you've briefly met when we open up the Zoom session. And then you're with her in that tape of whatever she's shared. What do you feel like you've, I don't know, learned or gleaned or noticed over the course of the last like 35, 36 sessions? Because you've been primarily the one editing these voices and these stories. What have you noticed?
Well, a very important thing I noticed is that the format we've chosen, that we basically hardly ask any questions. We start with, if you knew me, what would you tell me? And then the women start talking. And by just offering that format, they've been giving a lot of freedom in how they allow themselves to tell their story without being interrupted or guided or directed or whatever happened in the past in the classical way of interviewing. So they didn't have to live up to a standard or an expectation. They were just giving all the space to tell their story. And I think that's a major effect, that they just feel heard and understood, and that gives them, so it seems, more freedom to really share what they want, and that they're not being judged by the interviewer with critical questions. I think that's what I noticed, that when we give that to them, they take more freedom to express themselves and to talk about their deeper emotions and guilt and shame and all the things that happen in their life. I think a reason for not having told that is that they're always afraid of losing something, that they will be judged or will be, you name it, that something will happen to them if they tell their truth. And by giving them a lot of space to tell their real story, they take that freedom and then they tell their story.
We often talk about this difference of speaking from the head and speaking from the heart, just in our conversations as a couple with each other. And I know that that also plays out when we play back the recordings that we do with women for this podcast. Can you talk a little bit about the difference of what it feels like or sounds like when you get tape where someone was talking from the head or talking from the heart, and the effect that has on you as an editor and maybe the listeners as well?
Yeah, wow. That's not an easy one to explain. But somehow when I'm editing and I'm listening to a story and it doesn't really catch me, then I start wondering, why is that? Is that because the language the woman uses, or is it something else? And oftentimes it's really about that it's a rational story, as if the interviewee doesn't allow herself to be vulnerable. And then, it becomes more like a head story than a heart story. And then it's really hard, just as an editor, but I also believe as a listener, to stay and to wanting to keep on listening. It's really hard to explain that. Like, intuitively, we just know the difference between the two of them. For example, if I go back to my own story and say how many tears I cried about the loss of my sister, that kind of like draws, I guess, listeners in, like, what is happening there and how long did he suffer from that? And you get more curious about what really happened to that person instead of only listening to facts that are just summed up from a rational point of view.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is this big question that I contend with, and I think maybe you sometimes do too. I'm not sure. I've never asked you about it. But there is the story that we tell about ourselves and our lives, and that we can get kind of locked in our story. It becomes the narrative that we think is the truth, and then we kind of repeat that story to ourselves, and ultimately it limits us. And then what we are doing on the show is recording people's stories. And I'm wondering, because you've done so much thinking in your life around, you've done individual coaching of leaders and individuals and business executives to help people evolve, right? And have some kind of journey of personal development. What's the value of telling our story and claiming our story? And then where's the line where it ends up becoming the story that limits us?
I think that's a very great question, Jamie. I think it all comes down to, for yourself, to basically always tell the truth, whatever the truth is, especially in relationships, whether it's loving relationships or family or working relationships. If you withhold the truth because you're afraid of losing something or not getting anything, then you come up with a story that is not really the truth. And then usually you feel kind of depleted afterwards. And if you do that over a longer course of time, then it can end up in, say, depression, burnout. It can lead to like not very healthy emotional conditions for yourself. And I believe that first recognize for yourself, what is actually my truth? Am I prepared to share that truth with my partner, with friends, with other people? And also, am I just honest in what I want and what I don't want, without having to be afraid that I will lose something if I tell my own truth? Then a new world opens for you if you start doing that. And I believe by offering the show that we have developed, let's say offering an opportunity for people to tell their truth, I strongly believe that this helps a little bit for that person on the show, and for listeners listening to that story, probably, hopefully invites them to also follow that example and investigate for themselves, like, hey, what is actually my truth that I am not sharing with my environment? And if I would do that, can I also believe that my life would really improve instead of getting worse? That's what I believe. Taking the risk of telling the truth. And a lot of people, because the way they grew up, or they had to deal with trauma or all kinds of situations of loss in their lives, they kind of gotten used to not tell the truth and basically suppress that, and then, kind of have a miserable life for themselves. I don't think anyone would want that. Everyone wants to be happy. And I think a big part of being happy is just to be able to tell your truth without being afraid to having to lose something.
So I'm interpreting here, like the difference between, let's say, telling your story in a way that is liberating and telling your story in a way that is limiting. It's more about what the effect is on you as the storyteller or the person or the woman in this situation. Do you end up feeling bigger or more freedom or more expansion? Or do you feel like the story I keep telling about my life keeps me locked in? So it's not that story is in and of itself good or bad. It's more about the effect of it.
Well, if I just look at my own experience of, let's say, the story about the loss of my sister, actually, maybe the first 30 years of my life, or 40 even, I never told that story to anyone because I felt that as a betrayal. I was kind of betraying my parents somehow by sharing that story, or my part of the story, or my experience of the story. And I really felt that that fact had locked me in for a long time. And when I decided to, at some point, to not care anymore about that, because I don't think even my parents would care about that because they didn't even know that I was telling or sharing that story with other people. But when I started doing that, it really liberated me. And I thought, why wasn't I doing that before? Why didn't I just share that? Because on a very deep level, I think I was afraid that I kind of betrayed them or I spoke badly about them. And that's not how we are raised in this culture, I think, to talk badly about your parents, because then you betray them. And I think in all kinds of different constructions, people have that feeling about others that they're not sharing their truth because they're afraid of punishment of something or shame or guilt.
Or betraying.
Yeah. Because they basically have been protecting somebody else by not saying that.
Right.
There's a heavy weight on your shoulders, when you have to, let's say, put your own well-being not as a priority because you're protecting somebody else's so-called well-being.
Right. So at this point, we've gone through 3 seasons of the show. The first season, we called the show Full Moon Women. And then the second season, we changed the name to If You Knew Me, which you talked about earlier, inspired by this activity that you take people through when you do public speaking trainings, where you have them group into partners and then they go on a walk and one person asks the other person to finish the prompt, which is, if you really knew me, I would tell you this, or what would you tell me? And so we took that and we changed the show name to If You Knew Me. And so then we did 2 seasons with that. And now we're heading into the 4th season. Where do you think we are now with the show? Like, what has evolved in the show, in what we're doing for you from where you're sitting?
I believe that we carefully set the tone for our vision. Like, okay, this is what we had imagined, that we offer a stage to women to tell their truth and see how that is being received by listeners. And I think we are getting more and more traction and also a very positive response from mostly women listening. My idea is probably that we need to do like 3, 4, 5, 6 seasons more to kind of get a better feeling about where is it going. And maybe then slowly also kind of play with the idea that we could extend this format maybe also to men to make it more interesting and see what's happening to them. But I'm not sure. I think we need to do a lot of development work here and see if our idea is really like catching. I don't know.
What's your big vision for what this initiative can do in the world?
Yeah, that is
a big question.
It's a big question, but if I really look into my heart and soul and I look at, for example, the way my parents communicated with each other and how difficult that was, I truly believe that if we keep on doing this and say women are liberating themselves more by telling their own true story, that possibly, hopefully, their relationships with their spouses, whether it's men or women, doesn't really matter, improve dramatically. And therefore also their relationships with the children they have will improve dramatically. And so I believe this will kind of create a better world because there's more understanding and less judgment. And I think if we can contribute just a little bit to that, that would make me feel a lot happier and also give my life the purpose I was looking for.
Piet, it's been really fun talking to you in this really funny way.
Yeah.
I really hope that the listeners enjoyed hearing from you. I learned something from this conversation. Is there anything you want to say before we close out?
Well, what I really would like to say is like, keep on listening to all the beautiful content we're going to put out there, because I think there's great stories coming up in the next season and the next year. We promise that we will do our best to find the most beautiful stories out there that will inspire you to keep on listening and maybe also share your own story someday.
Beautiful. Well, thanks everybody so much for listening to this week's bonus episode with our very own Piet Hurkmans. I will just say that we are on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at ifyouknewme.show. Just look at the show notes to find the links. And last but not least, I want to let you know that we are in the midst of forming our first ever League of Women. We have invited a select group of women leaders to help us expand and elevate this podcast. And we are building that right now. I think we have about 8 women currently. And they will basically be surrounding us, supporting us, and helping us move our initiative forward. So if that sounds appealing to you in any way, definitely get in touch with us as soon as you are able. As always, this podcast is produced by us, my husband, Piet Hurkmans, and me. So thanks so much for listening to If You Knew Me. We will be back with you on January 6th with the beginning of our 4th season. Until then, have a good holiday. Bye, guys.